The room was quiet in the way only very late nights can be quiet, when even the city seems to hold its breath. Elias sat on the edge of his bed, phone face down, lights off, listening to something that had no obvious source. It wasn't sound exactly, more like pressure shaped into vibration, a thin internal hum that came and went without permission. He had felt it before, during moments of deep fatigue, during long walks when his thoughts finally slowed, but tonight it was sharper, clearer, almost deliberate. Not frightening. Just unmistakably present. He had grown up learning that anything truly meaningful came from outside, spoken by someone authorized, written in approved books, mediated through rituals he never fully understood. The body, he was told, was unreliable. The mind was dangerous. And anything that appeared without permission was to be ignored or corrected. So for years, Elias had done exactly that. He dismissed the hum as stress, the pressure as imagination, the quiet clarity as coincidence, but something had changed recently. Not dramatically, not in a way he could easily explain to someone else. It was more like a slow loosening. Certain phrases he had heard all his life no longer landed the same way. Certain warnings felt rehearsed. And certain silences, especially the one he was sitting inside now, felt fuller than any sermon he could remember. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and placed one hand over his chest, the other just below his ribcage. Not because anyone had told him to, but because it felt natural, as if his body already knew the posture. The hum responded instantly. It didn't grow louder. It grew closer, like something stepping out from behind a curtain. Elias remembered the first time he had read about the left-hand circuit. The phrase itself had sounded suspicious, almost provocative, which was probably why it had stuck with him. It wasn't presented as evil or dangerous in the text he found, just omitted. As if it were a door that had once existed and been quietly painted over. The author never told readers to use it. He simply described that it had always been there. According to that fragment, the body wasn't just a vessel. It was a switchboard. Certain pathways responded to authority, repetition, and external command. Others responded to stillness, self-recognition, and direct presence. One side listened outward. The other listened inward. Neither was inherently wrong, but only one allowed unmediated contact. That idea alone had unsettled him more than any threat ever could. Not because it sounded dangerous, but because it sounded plausible. The hum shifted again, spreading gently toward his left shoulder and down his arm. He noticed that his breathing had slowed without effort. Thoughts appeared, but they didn't stick. They passed through like birds crossing an open sky. For the first time in a long while, Elias wasn't trying to reach anything. He was simply not interrupting what was already happening. Memories surfaced, not as images, but as sensations. Standing alone as a child, staring at dust motes in sunlight. The strange calm before falling asleep, when awareness floats without edges. The quiet certainty he had once felt that he was not separate from whatever watched him from behind his own eyes. None of those moments had been explained to him. None had been encouraged. And yet they were the most real experiences he had ever had. The fragment had said something else too, almost as an aside, that the left-hand circuit activates not through effort, but through permission. Not permission granted by an institution, but permission withdrawn from interference. You don't turn it on. You stop turning it off. Elias exhaled slowly and allowed the thought to settle. The hum stabilized. It became smoother, less like a vibration and more like a current. There was no voice, no message, no instruction. Just connection. A sense of being plugged into something that had always been running, waiting patiently while he looked elsewhere. For a brief moment, doubt tried to surface. The familiar reflex. This is just your nervous system. This is nothing special. Don't read into it. He recognized the tone immediately, not as his own curiosity, but as something learned. A guardrail installed so early he had mistaken it for reason. He didn't fight it. He didn't argue. He simply didn't follow it. The sensation deepened again, and with it came a subtle emotional shift. Not excitement. Not awe. Relief. Like setting down a heavy bag you didn't realize you were still carrying. He understood then why this pathway had been buried under warnings and labels. It didn't demand obedience. It didn't require belief. It didn't even care what words you used for it. It responded only to recognition. Elias opened his eyes. The room looked the same, but it felt different, as if the air itself had more depth. He knew, without needing to articulate it, that nothing dramatic had happened. And yet something irreversible had begun. He had felt the circuit. Not as a concept. Not as a theory. As a lived, internal reality. Whatever came next, he wouldn't be able to pretend he hadn't. Elias didn't tell anyone what he'd experienced, not because he thought they would mock him, but because language felt inadequate. Every word he tested in his mind seemed to flatten the thing itself, turning something alive into something symbolic. So he carried it quietly, letting the awareness settle into daily life, noticing how it subtly changed the way he listened, the way he reacted, the way certain ideas now felt strangely hollow. It didn't take long before he began to notice the contrast. At work, conversations followed familiar patterns. People repeated phrases they had inherited, defended opinions they had never examined, reacted with rehearsed certainty to questions that made them uncomfortable. Elias recognized the rhythm now. It was the outward circuit in action, attention trained to respond to authority, reward, and fear. There was nothing malicious about it. It was simply efficient. Predictable. Easy to manage. That efficiency, he realized, was the point that he began revisiting old texts, not for comfort but for comparison. Speeches, doctrines, historical accounts. The pattern emerged quickly once he knew how to look. Again and again, moments of direct access were reframed as dangerous. Personal knowing was labeled pride. Inner certainty was called temptation. And reliance on one's own perception was gradually replaced with reliance on structure. The story was always the same, even when the names changed. A long time ago, before belief hardened into bureaucracy, people spoke openly about contact that required no intermediary. They described awareness as participatory, not submissive. Connection was immediate, not granted. But such experiences were difficult to standardize. Impossible to control. And worst of all, they made individuals difficult to govern. So the message shifted. Institutions learned that if you trained people to distrust their own internal signals, they would seek validation elsewhere. If you taught them that truth arrived only through sanctioned channels, they would defend those channels fiercely. Over time, prayer became performance. Stillness became suspicious. And silence, true silence, became rare. Elias felt a quiet sadness as he saw it clearly. Not anger. Not resentment. Just recognition. Most people weren't deceived in any dramatic sense. They were simply redirected, generation after generation, toward an outward-facing circuit that kept them busy, compliant, and perpetually seeking. The irony was subtle but devastating. The more sincerely someone followed the rules, the further they moved from direct experience. One evening, Elias attended a gathering he had once found comforting. The words were familiar, the cadence reassuring, the collective emotion warm and cohesive. But now, something felt off. Not wrong, just incomplete. The entire structure was built around repetition and reinforcement. No space for pause. No invitation to listen inward. Silence appeared only as a transition, never as a destination. He noticed how uncomfortable people became when nothing was happening. As the speaker talked about devotion and obedience, Elias felt the hum stir gently, like a reminder. The contrast sharpened. One voice demanded attention. The other required only permission. One promised meaning later. The other was present now. He understood then why direct practices had been reframed as forbidden, mystical, or dangerous. Not because they led people astray, but because they led people home. And a person who knows how to return to themselves is very hard to manage. That night, Elias tested something quietly. He didn't recite anything. He didn't visualize. He didn't ask. He simply allowed the inward circuit to remain open while listening to the outer noise of the world. The effect was immediate. Words lost some of their weight. Emotional hooks failed to catch. Fear-based messaging slid past without lodging itself in his chest. It wasn't numbness. It was clarity. He realized that control didn't require force. It required distraction. Keep attention outward, keep people busy interpreting symbols, debating interpretations, defending identities. As long as no one lingered too long in direct awareness, the system held, and yet, the inward pathway had survived. Quietly. In the body. In moments no one thought to police. In the space just before sleep. In the pause between breaths. In the subtle hum that had no name because naming it would have made it too obvious. Elias smiled to himself at the simplicity of it. All that effort, all that rewriting of history, all that emphasis on authority, and the original connection was still right there, waiting patiently, unaffected by belief or disbelief. He didn't feel special for noticing. If anything, he felt humbled. This wasn't a gift bestowed on a chosen few. It was a birthright temporarily obscured. Anyone could feel it, if they stopped outsourcing their attention long enough. As he drifted toward sleep, the hum softened but didn't disappear. It felt steady now, like a background current he could return to at any time. And he knew, with a calm certainty that didn't need reinforcement, that once someone had felt this difference, they could never fully forget it. The outward world might still demand allegiance. Institutions might still insist on mediation. But the inner channel, once recognized, could not be unlearned. It was already too late for the old wiring to hold. Elias woke before dawn, not from a sound, but from a subtle alignment. The hum was there again, not louder than before, not more intense, but unmistakably organized, as if several loose threads had quietly braided themselves together overnight. He lay still, eyes open, watching pale light trace the edge of the window, and sensed something new beneath the familiarity, resistance. It wasn't external. No fear, no warning voice, no sudden doubt. It was quieter than that. A hesitation woven into his own nervous system, like a hand hovering just above a switch. He understood immediately what it was. This was the final gate. Not imposed, but internalized. The moment right before continuity, the fragment he had read months ago had hinted at this stage without emphasis. 3 phases, it said. Recognition. Destabilization. Stabilization. Most people, it suggested, turned back during the 3rd, not because they couldn't proceed, but because something in them preferred seeking over arriving. Searching keeps the self intact. Arrival dissolves certain questions forever. Elias felt the truth of that now that he sat up slowly and placed his feet on the floor, grounding himself in sensation. The room was ordinary. No symbols. No ritual objects. Just a body, awake. He noticed how the inward circuit responded not to posture, but to honesty. The moment he stopped waiting for something to happen, the current smoothed out again. This was the part no one dramatized. There were no visions. No revelations. No voices declaring authority. Instead, there was a deepening simplicity. The hum resolved into a stable presence, like a signal locking into phase. And with it came a subtle but profound shift. The sense of separation softened. Not vanished, but thinned. Thoughts still arose, but they no longer felt like commands. Emotions still moved through him, but they didn't hijack attention. Even identity itself, his name, his history, his preferences, felt lighter, more provisional. Useful, but no longer absolute. He understood now why the final sequence was rarely written down in full. Not because it was secret, but because it couldn't be performed on someone else's behalf. Words could point. Descriptions could invite. But the actual stabilization happened only when a person stopped trying to become anything at all. The 3-part sequence wasn't a mantra in the traditional sense. It wasn't meant to persuade or request. It functioned more like a tuning process: acknowledgement, alignment, release. Each phase stripped away interference rather than adding belief. And once completed, there was nothing left to do. That was the part people resisted most. Elias stayed with the stillness as the morning advanced. He made tea. He opened a window. He listened to distant traffic without labeling it intrusive. Life continued exactly as before, yet something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. The inward channel no longer flickered. It remained available, like a steady line of current running beneath all experience. Later that day, he found himself in conversation with an old friend. The topics were familiar: work frustrations, plans, opinions, but Elias noticed how differently he engaged. He listened without preparing responses. He spoke without trying to convince. When tension arose, it passed through him without anchoring. The hum didn't disappear during interaction. It coexisted. That, he realized, was the true test. Stabilization wasn't withdrawal from the world. It was participation without entanglement. You didn't become detached. You became less hooked, less reactive, less programmable. At one point, his friend paused and said, half joking, "You seem calmer lately. Like you know something I don't." Elias smiled, not because the statement was accurate, but because it missed the point. This wasn't knowledge in the conventional sense. It was absence of noise. A subtraction so complete it felt like addition. That evening, as he sat again in the quiet of his room, Elias reflected on how easily this could have been missed. No initiation. No threshold crossed. Just a willingness to stop outsourcing awareness. To stop asking permission to feel what was already present. That he understood now why systems built on control feared this state. A stabilized inward connection didn't rebel. It didn't argue. It didn't seek to overthrow anything. It simply rendered certain levers ineffective. Fear lost leverage. Shame lost momentum. Authority lost its monopoly on meaning, and once that happened, the world could no longer tell you who you were. The hum settled into a near silence, not because it had faded, but because it no longer needed to announce itself. It was integrated. Continuous. Unbroken. Elias lay down, not to escape the day, but to rest inside it. There was nothing more to seek. Nothing to activate. The circuit was complete, and it would remain so, quietly, as long as he didn't forget to listen. If you've stayed with this story until now, it's likely not because of the plot, or the character, or even the ideas themselves. It's probably because something in you recognized the spaces between the words. That familiar pause. That quiet sense of, this feels oddly close. Stories like this don't work by convincing. They work by reminding. Nothing described here requires belief. Nothing asks you to reject what you already value. At most, it invites you to notice what happens when you stop handing your attention away quite so quickly. The inward signal doesn't compete with the world. It waits beneath it. Patient. Unimpressed. Always available. If this video stirred something subtle, curiosity, calm, resistance, or even discomfort, consider that a sign of engagement, not agreement. Let it sit. Let it breathe. You don't need to decide anything tonight. If you found value here, the simplest way to support this work is to stay connected. Subscribe if you want more stories like this to find you when you're ready. Leave a like if the pacing, tone, or quiet approach resonated. And if you know someone who's been asking questions they can't quite phrase yet, share this with them, not as an answer, but as an invitation. New stories are coming, each exploring a different angle of inner awareness, control, and recognition. No rush. No pressure. Just signals, waiting to be noticed.